Hello, welcome to my video, Red Psychology video on GCSE AQA Psychology Paper 1. We're going to review the whole of Paper 1 as quickly as possible, each of the different units. Let's go. First then, we're going to look at the memory topic. So to begin with memory, the overall title is called Processes of Memory. So this is how memory happens. You need to know what encoding, storage and retrieval is. Sometimes encoding is called coding. They're the same thing. So that's how you change information in order for it to be stored. Storage is holding on to the information, and then retrieval is how you get it back out of your memory systems. Different types of retrieval. You've got free recall, cued recall, or recognition. And then you've got different types of memory. You've got episodic memory, so that's memories for things that happen in your own life. You've got semantic memory, which is knowledge which is shared across all people. And then you've got procedural memory, so this is knowing how to do something, such as ride a bike, play the piano, tie your shoelaces. So these are all terms that you can then use later on, as we'll see in a second, looking at the multi-store model. So then you've got the structures of memory, and these are kind of combined together. So you've got the multi-store model of memory. You need to know what that model is. It was by Atkinson and Schifrin. You first have the sensory register, so information comes in from your senses and is taken into the sensory register. If you pay attention to that information, it then goes into short-term memory. Using those terms that we've looked at before, you need to know what each of those are in each of these stores. So in short-term memory, the encoding is acoustic, so the way that something sounds. The storage, how much, is 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. The retrieval is obviously we retrieve it. If it's still in our short-term memory, we can recall it straight away. If not, we have to rehearse it for it to go into our long-term memory. Otherwise, it's forgotten and falls out of the system. And then in long-term memory, the encoding is semantic, so the way that something means, what the meaning of the word is. And then you need to know the duration and capacity of these things as well. So in the sensory register, it's for milliseconds, but the capacity is as much as you can sense. The short-term memory, its capacity, as I said, 7 plus or minus 2, and the duration is about 30 seconds. And then long-term memory, duration is for up to a lifetime, and the capacity is potentially unlimited, but failure to retrieve is often the forgetting that happens in there. Next is then the primacy and recency effect, and that was studied by Murdoch, the first of the name studies in paper 1. So Murdoch's study, that was the serial position curve. This is where lists of words were given to participants. They were asked to recall them. The words were controlled. It was 4,000 of the most common words. They were similar lengths, similar meanings, and participants had to then recall them afterwards. And what was found was participants recalled the words early in the list and then later in the list better than they did the words in the middle. Don't forget to talk about the words in the middle if you're talking about this study. And the rationale for that, the conclusion is that the words early in the list, which is the primacy effect, that were remembered, it's because the information had time to go into your long-term memory, and the words later in the list, the recency effect, is because they're still held in short-term memory. So the Murdoch study can be used to back up the multi-store model, because if the multi-store model wasn't at least partly accurate, you wouldn't find the findings that you found in Murdoch's study. It was a highly controlled study. It was a lab experiment. That's a good thing because you can control, but obviously you then lack some realism. So quite often we're not remembering things that are just word lists. Human memory is much more complex than that. So when you're thinking about your evaluations, remember that side of things. Then we get into what's known as memory as an active process. This is where Bartlett comes in. It's good to know that you need to know kind of two things for Bartlett. One, his study, the War of the Ghost study, so that's the second name study. And then two, there's a separate thing here, the theory of reconstructive memory. So the two theories that you need to remember: one, multi-store model; two, theory of reconstructive memory. And then the studies, Murdoch's serial position curve, and then Bartlett's War of the Ghosts. So that's how those two are kind of set up. War of the Ghost study. So Bartlett asked participants to read, the first participant was read to read the Native American War of the Ghost story. You can find copies of that online. This is where they talk about people going to war in a canoe against some ghosts. It was intentionally a story that the participants, who were from Oxford University, hadn't come across before. So that was intentional because it meant that everyone was from the same starting point, but obviously you can criticize that as a weakness because it wasn't usual memory, it wasn't linked to people's culture. And so that's something that doesn't normally happen. But maybe actually learning a story is better than learning a word list because we do deal in stories. Bartlett was also criticised for potentially finding results that he thought were going to back up his study anyway. So that was the War of the Ghosts study, and then that links to his theory of reconstructive memory. So what the findings of that study were that their people's memory was inaccurate. So that's part of the theory of reconstructive memory. We are inaccurate with our memory, that we remember fragments of information and we put that back together again, and that's where issues tend to happen. We've got this effort after meaning, so we remember the meaning of the words, but then meaning of the stories, and then put our own thoughts based on our own experience, our past, our culture has an impact on how we recall things. So, for example, people were recalling boats rather than canoes because boats were more culturally appropriate to the participants in the study. So that was the theory and the next study. And then the last bit of the memory topic looks at the factors affecting accuracy. So there are three of them: interference, context, and false memories. You don't have to know the studies here. They're not named studies. However, they do help you to understand these three things. So interference is where similar information is harder to recall because of interference. The memory confuses each other. Either new memories confuse old memories, or old memories impact what you're trying to remember new. So learning similar information is difficult. This was the McGeough and McDonald study where participants were given a word list to remember. And then participants either had to remember a list of synonyms, so similar words, or antonyms, opposite words, or numbers, or no other word list. And what they found was the closer the second word list was to the first one, the more inaccurate people were. So that's interference affecting memory. Similar information impacts memory more. Next, you've got context. So this is the fact that we remember information better in the context, in the environment that we learnt it, than we do in a different environment. This was the Godden and Badley study, the scuba diver study. So participants either had to learn a word list on land and underwater, and then they had to recall it on land and underwater. And what they found was the participants that had to learn the word lists on land and recall them on land recall better. The participants who had to learn underwater and recall underwater recall it better. But if they had to learn underwater and recall it on land, or learn on land and recall it underwater, that's where the memory was impacted. So context impacts our memory, affects our accuracy of memory. And finally, you've got false memories. So these are memories of an event which didn't actually happen. This was the Loftus Lost in the Mall study. They told participants that when they were younger, they were lost in a mall, shopping mall. These participants recalled quite specific details of this happening, whereas this event never actually happened. They got the participants' families involved as well. And so it shows us false memories impact our accuracy of our memory as well. So that's the memory topic. Next, we look at perception. So firstly, you need to know about the difference between sensation and perception. So sensation is something we take in from our senses, and then perception is how we interpret that information. You've then got visual cues and consistency. So you've got binocular depth cues, so retinal disparity and convergence. Binocular is happening with both eyes. Retinal disparity is where the one eye takes in information in a slightly different place than the second eye does. Your brain combines those two to get an image, but actually seeing things from each eye will show them in a slightly different place. Convergence is where the eye muscles move to track an object. So if you try and track your finger when you touch it on your nose, you'll see that happening. So those are binocular depth cues. They help us to see depth. And then you've got the monocular depth cues. So these are generally on 2D images. You've got height in plane. So how high up an image is, how high up something is on an image will determine how far away it is. Normally the higher up it is, the further away it is. Relative size. So the bigger an image on a 2D picture, generally closer to the camera it would be. Occlusion is when one thing covers another, so the thing covering the thing behind it will generally be perceived as being closer. And then linear perspective is like the railway tracks where you've got two parallel lines but they look like they're converging at the end. So those are your visual cues and your constancies. And then you've got the visual illusions. So you need to know about the Ponzo illusion, Muller-Lyer, Rubin's vase, the Amy's room, the Necker cube, and Kansas triangle. And then why these things happen. So generally it's due to misinterpreted depth cues. So that's the Ponzo illusion, Muller-Lyer illusion, Amy's room, misinterpreted depth cues. Or they're ambiguous, so they could be seen in different ways. So that's Rubin's vase and the Necker cube. Or you've got what's known as fiction. So this is where something not actually there, but your eyes trick you to think it is there, and that's Canizza's triangle. So these things, all of that really is AO1. You'll get asked AO1 questions on them, or application, quite likely, is how you normally get asked questions on these. I've seen some diagrams. You have to draw some of the illusions. Hopefully, Ponzo Muller rather than Rubin's vase, but who knows? Then we get into the theories. So first you've got Gibson's theory. So this is the direct theory of perception. So this is saying that it's the nature approach of nature nurture. Gibson believes that we're born with an ability to perceive the world around us. And use this thing called optic flow patterns or motion parallax. So motion parallax, if you're in a car and you look out the window next to you, the passenger window, you'll see things going by quite fast, whereas if you look at the front of the window, they might seem stationary, and so that's your brain looking at these motion cues to help you perceive depth perception. There was the Gibson and Walk study, so that was where they had the infants go over kind of a glass panel that was over an edge, and the babies didn't do it, and so that suggests that perception isn't learnt, it's pre-built within us. So it's very much the direct theory and nature approach to perception. You compare that then with Gregory's theory, Gregory's constructivist theory. That's a nurture approach. So Gregory suggested that actually we learn how to perceive, and that means that our experiences, our background, our culture will impact our ability to perceive the world, and we make inferences. So we make conclusions based on the information that's around us. And then you look at the factors affecting perception. So you've got culture, you've got emotion. So those two, again, there are studies linked to them. They're not named studies, but culture. So Hudson, this was where you had South African white and black participants who were either schooled or non-schooled, non-educated, and they found that that seemed to have an impact on their perception of images. For this example, it was a picture of a hunter and an elephant and antelope, and how they could perceive that. There were issues on that study though. And then you've got emotion. So this is McGinney's study, the taboo words. So you had neutral words or taboo words. They measured what's known as galvanic skin response, so sweat on the palms or reaction time, and found it was longer for the taboo words. So how emotional we are towards something can change how we perceive it. And then you've got the two name studies in this topic. So similar to the memory topic, similar to most topics, you've got different theories and different studies. You can get asked 9 markers on them. So the theories here, Gibson's theory, Gregory, and then we're about to get into the two named studies. So motivation, this was the Gilchrist and Nesberg study. This is where they had participants. It was an independent groups design lab experiment. They had one group of participants who were starved for 20 hours, and the second group of participants weren't starved for 20 hours. All participants were shown images of food such as spaghetti or fried chicken, steaks, and that was on a screen. And then they changed the brightness of the screen, and then they asked the participants in the different groups to put the brightness back up to what it was before. What they found was the participants who had been starved, they put the brightness up higher. So the conclusion there was that our motivation, hunger in this instance, affected our perception and how we perceive the world. Obviously there's issues there. Well, there's strength, lab study, there was lots of control. The brightness was the same, they had the same amount of time, they controlled how hungry they were. But the issue is here, obviously in the real world, we don't get asked to put the brightness of images. That's not a realistic task, not a realistic test of motivation. And then you've got expectations. So this is the Brunner and Minturn. All participants were shown an ambiguous figure that could have been perceived as the letter B or the number 13. One group, again, independent groups done. One group were shown the letters A and C either side of the ambiguous figure. The other group were shown the numbers 12 and 14. And so it's known as kind of priming. What you see beforehand changed how the people saw it. So the participants that saw the letters perceived the ambiguous figure as a letter, as B, and the participants that saw the numbers in general saw the ambiguous figure as numbers. Again, you can criticize. So lots of the lab studies here were saying that it's quite artificial as a weakness, but as a strength, we can see the you can control them, which is really positive. Next is the development topic, which starts with looking at early brain development. So this is an introduction to the brain and neuropsychology, which is developed on in paper 2. For now, you just need to know about the brain stem, which controls autonomic functions, breathing, heart rate, etc. Then you've got the cerebellum, which is at the base of the brain, not far from the brain stem. And this controls things like motor movements, balance is in there. Then you've got the thalamus, which is the hub, so it sends and receives information to other areas. And then you've got the cortex, so this is the outer casing of the brain, and this is where decision making, higher order cognitive thoughts are happening. And then it's just this nature and nurture debate, which comes up through the rest of the course as well. So what of our being can we determine as being nature, so being biological, inherited, and what is nurture, what comes through environment, and the examples they gave here are things like getting infections and smoking. Those are environmental influences on us as we develop as young children and babies, even before we're born, potentially. Then a lot of time spent looking at Piaget's theory, so Piaget's stages of development. You would have come across the schemas, accommodation, assimilation, so developing these kind of cognitive structures to get the information, and then it goes into looking at the stage of development. So you've got the sensory motor stage, 0 to 2 years. You've got then where children are dealing with sensory information, so how things look and touch and taste and smell and sound, and then motor information, movement, they're starting to walk and crawl and starting to talk. Again, that comes up in paper 2. And then you've got the pre-operational stage, so this is 2 to 7, and this is where we look in a second in a bit more detail about things like conservation and egocentrism. By now, from the sensory motor stage, they'll have already developed something called object permanence, knowing that things still exist if they can't see them. And in the pre-operational stages where children learn conservation, so by the end of that stage, by about 7, they should be able to conserve number and volume, and they become less egocentric. They can see things from other people's point of view. That then leads you to the concrete operational stage. This is where they can deal in concrete numbers, things like following a recipe, counting, being a shopkeeper type thing would be fine. And then you've got, and that's 7 to 11, and then 11 plus, you've got the formal operational. This is where kind of higher order thinking happens. So moral arguments, debates, algebra, that sort of thing would happen. There is what Piaget would say, and Piaget did a number of experiments to test the theory and test the outcomes. McGarrigle and Donaldson criticised one of those series. So Piaget looked at conservation. He looked at the conservation of number, looking at counters. He put counters in front of children, 2 similar amounts of counters, then moved one of the sets of counters and asked, is this the same amount? And children would say, no, it's not. And then that's conservation of number. And then conservation of volume. This is liquid. So you'd have 2 beakers, the same amount of water. Then you might pour the liquid into a taller, thinner glass, and it looks like there's more. And quite often younger children especially would say, oh no, there's more there. They couldn't, and Piaget would say they couldn't conserve number. What McGarrigle and Donaldson said is that actually in Piaget's experiments, the children were responding to the adults purposely moving things, and they're used to following instructions from parents and teachers. And so McGarrigle and Donaldson said, well, if we did this in a different way, so let's do it with a naughty Teddy who accidentally moves the counters, will children react in the same way? And they found that no, they didn't. So the percentage correct was around 41% in the Piaget type experiment, whereas with the naughty Teddy it was over 60%. So McGarrigle and Donaldson said that children reacted better. They were less their performance was better at egocentrism than what Piaget had said. However, what they did still find is that the older children were better than the younger children, supporting Piaget's theory that children develop as they grow up. And a similar sort of thing happened with egocentrism. So Piaget tested egocentrism using something called the 3 mountains task. Children had to see a scene with snow-covered mountains. One had a cross on, one had a building on, and say whether they could see things from another person's point of view. Hugh said, well, that's a very strange task. Piaget conducted lots of his studies sometimes with his own children, but sometimes in Switzerland as well. And we're saying, well, do children in general see this? So Hughes developed what was known as the policeman doll study. There were two intersecting walls. Children were shown how to hide the boy doll from the policeman doll. Another policeman doll was brought in, and children had to show where the boy doll should go to not be seen. And they found about 90% accuracy. So the children were better, less egocentric when the task was more socially appropriate to them. And so again, criticised Piaget's theory of egocentrism, but supported the theory of the developmental theory and stages, because the older children were better again. And then finally, on the Piaget stage theory, there's the application to education. You need to know about things such as readiness, discovery learning, a child-centered approach, or an individualized approach. These are all things that came out the back of Piaget's research, because they can be applied in those ways. So all linked to Piaget. And then the last part of this topic looks at the effects of learning on development. So a couple of different theories here. You've got Dweck's theory, Dweck's mindset, fixed and growth mindset theory. So someone with a fixed mindset believes that they can't get better. They believe that talent is down to biology. You're either a good basketball player or a mathematician and you can't improve. Or you've got a growth mindset where you believe that actually if you fail, that's a chance to learn and get better. We can all develop. It's very, very much more nature-based. Nurture-based than nature-based. And then kind of linked to that a bit, you've got praise. Dweck believed that you should praise effort rather than outcomes, and that you shouldn't praise everything. It should be selective praise. And there was a link here also to self-efficacy. So this was where how well we believe we do at something. We get our self-efficacy from feedback from peers or teachers or parents, from our own feedback as well. So if we try something and we feel we're not good at it, could be maths, could be football, then we believe that we're not very good, so our self-efficacy is low. You can increase someone's self-efficacy by giving them tasks that they can do, so more straightforward maths tasks, for example. And then you've got learning styles. So learning styles suggest that we should learn in the style that we prefer. So you've got visualizers who like seeing things, verbalizers who like words, and then kinesthetic learners who like action, doing things. This has been heavily criticized. There's not any research really that supports that learning your preferred learning style improves your outcomes. Instead, you should learn in the learning style appropriate for the task. So if you're looking at maps in geography, that should be a visual. And that's where Willingham came in. So Willingham criticised learning styles, saying that there's no supporting research, and what we should do instead is follow the research. So where the research does back things up. So for example, there is research into praise, like Dweck spoke about. So we should praise effort rather than outcomes. Memory, we've already looked at the memory topic. So how can we use our memory systems to appropriately learn something? He spoke about self-regulation. So this is children being able to kind of put delayed gratification. You might know the Walter Mischel marshmallow test. So if you can put in effort now for an outcome later on, you're better off. And then neuroscience, and again that comes up a bit more in paper 2, but yeah, if we understand what our brains are doing, then that might help. Probably, yeah, the 9 markers in this topic: McGarrigle, Johnson, and Hughes, and the name studies. The theories are the stage theory of development, Dweck's theory, Willingham's theory. So you should be prepared for 9 markers in those. Finally, we've got the research methods section. Don't forget, obviously, research methods comes up in every other section, paper 1 and paper 2, so worth knowing across the board. To begin with, in research methods, you need to know what an aim is, a hypothesis, an IV independent variable, DV dependent variable, extraneous variable, and control of those. So independent variable is the variable that's manipulated. The dependent variable is the one that's measured. The hypothesis, if you get asked to write a hypothesis, don't forget that you need to operationalize. You need to put in the levels of the IV and what the operationalized DV is, and the difference between a null and an alternate hypothesis. Null being you say there's going to be no effect of the IV on the DV, alternate you say there is going to be one. And correlational hypotheses are slightly different. You would say there'll be a relationship between one thing and another. Then you get on to types of experiments. So you've got lab, field, and natural. The big difference here is one, who or where the IV is controlled. So in a lab experiment and a field experiment, the researcher will decide who allocate participants to the IV, whereas in a natural they're naturally occurring. In a lab experiment it happens in an artificial environment, whereas in a field and natural it happens in a more natural environment. Then you've got types of experimental design. This is probably the most commonly confused part of research methods. If you're asked for a research design, people often say lab. Design specifically relates to how your participants are put into groups, so independent measures, repeated measures, or matched pairs. So there's a big difference there. And then we get on to sampling. So the four that you need to know about: random, opportunity, systematic, stratified. Random. Again, this is the questions you normally get here is how would you conduct one of these? So don't forget you need to go in a step-by-step process. So for a random sample, you would need to get a list of all the participants in the target population. You would then use random sampling. So you'd put the names into a hat, or you would put them into a computer program, and then you would pick the number of participants you need. So there are 100 people in the target population, and then you need 10. You'd pick the first 10 out, or tell the computer program to give you 10 and use those participants. So if this was a how question, that you'd have to use those steps. Opportunity, you're using the participants that are available at the time. Systematic, you again would need a list of all the target population, and then you would use the every nth term. So say it's 100 participants, you would use every 10th. And use those as participants. And then stratified is where you have proportional representation. So say you have, I don't know, 60% of your cohort is male, 60% of the target population is male, then you would want 60% of your participants to also be male, and that can be based on, I don't know, age, gender, whatever. So whatever you're choosing to allocate that on. Ethics, so you need to know about informed consent, deception, gaslighting as my participants sometimes call it, but it's deception. Protection from harm, so participants need to leave the experiment in the same state of mind as they entered it. Privacy, so difference between privacy and confidentiality. Privacy, you've got a right to privacy, so you shouldn't be recorded in your own home. You shouldn't be recorded in an area that you don't give consent to. Confidentiality is information about yourself being published, so this is names, addresses, so you can use pseudonyms. Pictures shouldn't be published, so that's the difference between privacy and confidentiality. Questions you get on ethics are generally how you would control these things, so informed consent, giving participants a brief, normally gets over informed consent. Deception, if you still have to deceive participants, because if you give away the aim it would affect the experiment, then a debrief would help with that. So don't forget how you would deal with the ethical considerations. Interviews and questionnaires, so the difference there, interviews are normally face-to-face, whereas questionnaires are normally written. You can have open or closed, or structured or unstructured questions. And then we look at observations. So observations can be covert or overt. So covert is undercover, overt, people know it's happening. You can have naturalistic or controlled. So naturalistic, you're just observing what's happening in a natural environment. Controlled, the researcher has probably done something to the environment to see what the participants do. Participant or non-participant, that's in relation to the researcher. So does the researcher get involved, in which case it's a participant, or don't they? So it's non-participant. And then you need to consider inter-observer reliability. So this is where you have behavioural categories. Say, for example, you want to observe bullying behaviour in a year 5 playground. You're probably going to do that overtly, because covert's a bit weird and creepy. You're probably going to do that. You might want that naturalistic, because you might want to see what happens normally, but you could put some things in place. So you could put particular toys to see if different sorts of toy, a traditional masculine or traditional feminine toy, might impact the behaviour. So you might control that observation. You can't be a participant because you're not year 5. And then this inter-observer reliability, you would need to define your behavioural categories. So what do you mean by bullying? You can't just say bullying. So we'll say aggressive behaviour. Again, you'd have to define what that is. So punching, slapping, kicking, pushing. So that's you defining your observations. And this inter-observer reliability, if one researcher says yes, this child has hit another one, has pushed another one, you'd also want your other observer to be saying the same thing. So you would test this using a correlation. So that's inter-observer reliability. Then you look at correlations. Correlations come up quite often. If you get a correlation, if it talks about a relationship between two things, then it's a correlation. You would use a scatter graph. You can have positive, negative, or no correlations, zero correlations in your scatter graphs. They have a different hypothesis, as I said before. You also need to know about case studies. So case studies are smaller studies, normally an individual or a small group of participants, and that's a case study looking at an individual thing. They can be longitudinal, so they happen over a period of time, which can be good because you can then track behaviour. You might get a bit more bias potentially because the participants, the researchers sometimes get it's hard to be more objective when you're studying the same people over a long time. Then you've got reliability and validity. So reliability is consistently getting results. So if you were to repeat the experiment, would you get similar results? And validity is measuring what you intend to measure. So that's where if you've got good control, you might have good internal validity but poor external validity. So it's good inside the study, but maybe outside the study it doesn't apply. And different things can affect the reliability and validity. The data you need to look at can be qualitative, quantitative, primary, secondary. So quantitative data is obviously easily comparable. You can put graphs and things together. Qualitative, you get more rich, detailed information. Descriptive statistics, you need to know about the range, mean, median, mode. You need to know about a normal distribution as well. So that's on this display of data. So you could get asked to do a histogram, a bar chart, a scatter graph, as I said, normal distribution. So in a normal distribution, the mean, median, and mode are all in the middle of that normal distribution. And then calculations. So you could get asked to calculate decimals, fractions, ratios, percentages, standard forms, significant figures. That's all the maths you've been doing for years and years. Don't forget, for lots of these things, maybe not so much the data, although you can get asked why would you do a mean over a mode, but certainly for the types of experiment, for the designs, for the sampling, interviews, questionnaires, observations, correlations, case studies, you need to know about the strengths and weaknesses of doing these studies.